Before we start the show, let me thank you for clicking onto this video. If you'd like to see more videos like these, why not subscribe and hit the bell button so you'll never miss an episode. Now, on with the show. Greetings, everybody. Welcome back to Lewis Jarvis Show. How's it going, everybody? It's been a long time no see. So, because I've enjoyed doing a last church analyst video, I've been wanting to do something similar for some time. And what better way than Hubrecht joined me to have a little book club over Trollslayer, or at least one of the stories from that said book. So, yeah, Hubrecht, welcome back to the channel. How's it been?
Hello. I've been great. Thank you for asking, Lewis.
No problem. But yeah, from the introduction, I really did enjoy our last church analyst video, and I've been, of course, I want to do something like that for some time, and because you and I are such big fans of Gotrek and Felix, I thought, well, wouldn't it be cool if we did something like that again, but with Gotrek and Felix, of course. And what better way than doing this than talking about their first ever short story. Before I tell you my story of how I discovered them, how did you discover them, Hubrecht?
My introduction to, I was introduced to 40k before I was introduced to fantasy, but I was introduced to Warhammer Fantasy through the Total War Warhammer game. And at first I was kind of confused, which seems to be a recurring thing with me, being confused when first introduced to Warhammer stuff. If you remember how I told you of how I got introduced to 40k.
Yeah.
Basically, I was like, okay, I know now what 40k is. Oh, there's gonna be a Total War about Warhammer game. Awesome. Wait, why it's everything medieval Renaissance? I thought this was in space. Why is it though? Why is everything named in German, in German-ish sort of words? Why are they dwarves? Like, what's happening here? And then some friends on my hobby store told me that, oh, there's several Warhammer worlds. 40k is the one in space, and fantasy is Lord of the Rings, but it's grimdark Lord of the Rings, basically.
That is the best way to describe it, and then you'll find out there's actually a sequel of Warhammer Fantasy called Age of Sigmar, because they retired fantasy just when they made the Total War games. Yeah,
that's probably one of the biggest Fs in GW history, because we all know the story about, by this point, of why they retired fantasy. Fantasy was basically a game that wasn't producing anymore. It was pretty much stuck in limbo. Yeah, but it's the Total War Warhammer game is the biggest selling Total War to date, and it pretty much introduces a lot of people to the world of Warhammer Fantasy. And just as its popularity is bigger than ever, instead of resurrecting, taking the game out of limbo with new edition or new minis, they pretty much nuke the old world in the end times. And well, how people feel about the end times.
It wasn't the greatest last chapter to a franchise, I will have to admit.
Yeah.
But that was your introduction to fantasy, but how did you discover the two characters exactly?
Well, pretty much the same way. The friends I made at the hobby store when I started with 40k, well, they had been at the hobby for years themselves now, so they were pretty much very well versed in both 40k and fantasy. And when I asked, okay, I know how 40k is, but how is fantasy? How are there any books you recommend to me? Should I read something? Is it worth getting to know it? And they said, yeah, definitely read two. There's pretty much two series that are a perfect introduction to fantasy. The first there's the first book ever written for fantasy, which is Gotrek and Felix, which till this day I haven't read. It's still on the list. And the other, obviously, was Gotrek and Felix. And literally everyone talked about Gotrek and Felix. Everyone talked about, oh, remember when Gotrek did this and when Felix did that? They talked about it as if it was a comic that they read all every week because their novels are very episodic. It's basically Gotrek and Felix wandering around both the old world and the new world, and in search for that oh so glorious heroic death that Gotrek is desperate to find, but can never seem to find. And there was this joke that Gotrek is the worst Slayer ever because he doesn't die.
Yeah, that is basically what Gotrek is. He is basically the worst Slayer because he is not doing well on his job, and we'll have a talk about what exactly a Slayer is during the video. But as for my little story, I actually discovered Gotrek and Felix as I discovered Space Marine. It was through a YouTuber's video talking about the characters, and hearing about Gotrek and Felix, this made me think, oh, this sounds really, really cool, and the Warhammer Fantasy world sounds really, really cool. And eventually I would get eventually when the collector's edition of Trollslayer came out, I picked that up. And when Trollslayer was out on audiobook on the Black Library app, this is where I would actually, buy the book to actually read it, or listen to it in this case. And I gotta say, that was such an experience. It was like reading Gaunt's Ghost for the first time.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's where Gotrek and Felix are in like the tier of Warhammer literature that are almost as big, or if not more greater than Gaunt's Ghost or Caiaphas Cain in terms of in terms of being how important they are and how impactful they are,
Yeah, basically, a lot of people, a lot of those friends that introduced me, more avidly to Warhammer Fantasy, and especially because they know that I like history very much, and Warhammer Fantasy is pretty much a lot of the factions are, quasi-historical factions, but on steroids, basically. It pretty much it's Gotrek and Felix is always talked about as this series of books that it's the equivalent. It did to Warhammer Fantasy what Gaunt's Ghost did for 40K,
Definitely. I can't agree more. And what's funny is that Gotrek and Felix all began because of the writer's game of Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, if you didn't know that.
Oh, no, I was not aware of that.
Yeah, so in the collector's edition of the Trollslayer book, they have the author's like little introduction piece in the beginning of the book where he looks back on his story and where the inspiration came from. And he would say that it all came from his game of Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, which is basically, Games Workshop's version of D&D. But yeah, and the story that we're discussing, the Geheimnisnacht, the first story in this anthology-like book of Trollslayer, because that is basically what Trollslayer is. It's more of an anthology that has stories that continue off the other than just being just one big story, if you see where I'm going at.
Yes.
But within the first short story, that was the author's game of Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. But the difference is that at the ending of his game, the Slayer that was with the party, actually died in the quest. However, the author decided, well, there could be a potential book series of these two characters. So why don't I change the fate of the Slayer and I can use him for more stories later on? And you can imagine the hindsights this would bring later on, Or or what am I saying? Or like, imagine, yeah, it's like that was a really good call, dude.
Honestly, I think. Yeah, I didn't know that, and yeah, that William King did a very good call because basically what Gotrek and Felix do, I think that they serve as a great introduction to Warhammer Fantasy in general. Like the other book series inside the universe are also great, although I haven't read as much of them. There's a series of book on Sigmar's origins, there's a series of books on, the Sundering of the Elves, or books on, Chaos Warriors, much like there is in 40k. But what Gotrek and Felix do is you start from the Empire, you start in the Empire, which is basically the quote-unquote protagonist faction of fantasy. You kind of get introduced to the context of where the Empire is at the moment.
And if I could say something, if I could say something real quick, actually, not mean to interrupt you, when comparing the Empire to the Imperium of Man in 40k, there are factions within Warhammer Fantasy that are more or less the good guys, and Fantasy is a lot more hopeful than 40k, because in Fantasy there is the typical, the savior will help out humanity in the world to fight against the Dark Lords and all that. So there is a subtle lightness to the fantasy world, and like how I said, there are sort of more protagonists in this sort of setting. Like, sort of the Empire can be a dick to its citizens, but it's not like the Imperium. It's not trying to survive. Or at least it's not in the worst case scenario in which it needs to be absolutely brutal, like the Imperium,
It is trying to survive, and it does have to be brutal somewhat, but not to the massive scale of the Imperium. It hasn't. I think it's due to the scale of the thing, because we're still talking about a kingdom on an Earth-like planet with defined borders, and not a galactic superpower with billions upon billions of worlds that there's so many that even their rulers sometimes forget that they are there.
Mm-hmm.
So I think 40k scale adds to the grim darkness. Even if 40k can sometimes have that hopeful heroism, sometimes fantasy definitely is more hopeful. There's more more. It's still grim dark, but it is
light's grimdark.
Yeah, it's more optimistic. So it's more optimistic, at least more often than 40k.
Yeah, if we're talking about grim darkness, imagine it like a primer, right? So 40k would be Chaos Black. That's its primer. But whereas for Fantasy and AOS, that's more of Korax White primer. It's still grim dark, but it's a different shade of it.
Yeah, I think I agree, definitely.
And yeah, sorry, you were saying something earlier before I interrupted you?
No problem. I think what I was saying is that, so Gotrek and Felix, all throughout their book series, they pretty much wander the entirety of the the Warhammer world in these misadventures, I think you could call them. Mm-hmm. And technically speaking, Gotrek and Felix do this thing in which they technically introduce you to everyone, everything, and every place, because they have been all over. So it's like Gotrek and Felix fight Skaven, they fight dragons, they fight chaos, they fight vampires, they fight ogres, orcs, beastmen. They encounter elves, so
eventually they fight a troll in the story.
Yeah, so essentially it's a their episodic adventures. I think they're the perfect introduction to anyone and wanting to get into the world of Warhammer Fantasy.
And as the series goes on, you'd be surprised as how much they frequently reference to other nations across the world, not just like say Bretonnia or Kislev, but they also bring up Araby, Cathay, Nippon, or Nippon. I apologize, and because these sort of countries are more or less in the background in the actual game itself, it is actually really interesting to see, characters like Felix reference the nations from time to time.
Yeah, it actually is. And it's funny now that Cathay has an actual roster,
Mm-hmm. And that's going to be exciting when they explore that more in the tabletop. Yeah.
Yeah, it definitely will. I honestly, I have this idea that when Warhammer: The Old World, which for those of you who don't know is pretty much GW's admittance of, oh, we shouldn't have killed Warhammer Fantasy, so we're bringing it back, but on another time period. Basically, I imagine that Black Library will start publishing stories in Warhammer Fantasy again. Although I don't think we'll see Gotrek and Felix go back to the old world because, well, Felix wouldn't have been born, and, well, maybe Gotrek would, but Gotrek is now gallivanting around the mortal realms in AOS.
Yeah, so it'd be like, what will be the point then of having yet another Gotrek series, but set in like further back when he was probably a teenager at this time?
Yeah, probably.
Because dwarves are like turtles; they're very long living.
Yes, I remember. I remember this bit of one of the books of Sigmar's stories, and I don't. It's been a while since I read it, but I think Sigmar and his friends meet a dwarf that it's associate of them, and they haven't seen him in like I don't know if it's been 5 years or even 10 years, but they're like, oh, my friend, it's been so long since we've seen you, and the dwarf is like, it's been too little. It's it's not been any time at all. Stop crying, manling.
Yeah. But so yeah, without delaying the show any further, let's set the scene.
After the terrible events and nightmare adventures we endured in Altdorf, my companion and I fled southwards, following no path more certain than that chosen for us by blind chance. We took whatever means of transport presented itself: stagecoach, peasant cart, dryage wagon, resorting to our own 2 feet when all else failed. It was a difficult and fear-filled time for me. At every turning, it seemed, we stood in imminent danger of arrest and either imprisonment or execution. I saw sheriffs in every tavern and bounty killers behind every bush. If the Trollslayer suspected that things might not have been otherwise, he never bothered to communicate this information to me. To one as ignorant of the true state of our legal system as I then was, it seemed all too possible that the entire apparatus of our mighty and extensive state might be bent to the apprehension of 2 fugitives such as ourselves. I did not then have any idea of quite how feebly and randomly the rule of law was applied. It was indeed a pity that all those sheriffs and all those bounty killers who peopled my imagination did not, in fact, exist. For perhaps then evil would not have flourished quite so strongly within the boundaries of my homeland. The extent and nature of the evil was to become very clear to me one dark evening after boarding a southbound stagecoach, on what is perhaps the most ill-omened night in our entire calendar.
Yeah, after that awesome quote by Ineptus, thank you, my man, for the narration. It was a awesome quote as always. Yeah.
Yes, it was. Good job, Ineptus.
So, how does the first ever story of Gotrek and Felix begin? Well, it begins. So sorry. Do you want to go? Do you want to tell the story?
No, don't. Go ahead. Go ahead.
No problem. So, it begins with them lost in the woods after Gotrek gets them both kicked off a stagecoach late at night. After he was talking trash towards the driver and his wife. And this wouldn't be so bad if this didn't happen on what is basically German Halloween.
Yes. So Gotrek and Felix find themselves with as Felix very describes very well in the story the most ill-omened night in their calendar, Geheimnisnacht. So, for those of you who don't know, Geheimnisnacht is or also known as Night of Mysteries, made from the German words Geheim for secret, and Nacht for night. So secret night, Night of Mysteries. Basically, what this thing is, it's one of two nights in the world of Warhammer Fantasy, in which Moorsleeve is closest to the world of Warhammer Fantasy. Do you want to explain what Moorsleeve is, Lewis?
Right. So Moorsleeve is one of two moons that actually orbit the fantasy world, the other moon being Mansleep. And the reason why Moorsleeve is such a big deal on nights like Geheimnisnacht is that, well, whereas Mansleep is just a regular moon, Moorsleeve is a giant moon made out of warpstone. And also, because of what warpstone is, especially when the series goes on, a piece of mineral that's associated with chaos energy. It's also named after the god of death within the Empire, so you can imagine why Moorsleeve is not the most, maybe not well-liked moon, but it's not a appreciated moon to see on a night like Geheimnisnacht.
Yeah, basically it's one of those nights where Moorsleeve is a completely full moon and the closest to the Earth. Moorsleeve is also known as the Chaos Moon or the Dark Moon or the Black Moon. All those very encouraging names. Only for some bit lore reference, almost all the cultures in Warhammer Fantasy have a name for this night. So in the Empire, it's Geheimnisnacht. In Bretonia, it's called Winter's Eve. The dwarves call it Ar Uskul, and the elves call it Twilight's Tide. It is unknown if the infamous Death Night of the Dark Elves takes place in this particular night, but it wouldn't surprise me if it did, honestly.
And the reason why Geheimnisnacht is such a big deal for any cultures across the world is that this is the night not only when Moorsleeve is full mooned during a night like that, but it's also an event in which the reality between the fantasy world and chaos becomes paper thin. And because it becomes paper thin, the winds of magic are more or less in their strongest. And this is where demons, chaos cultists, and beastmen can have a day to themselves, right?
Yeah.
And this is where a chaos cult can summon a demon and they can have their time with them as they please. This is where beastmen can get wild up in the woods and try to invade the local village, or if they're feeling really daring, a local city, if it's not that well defended.
Yeah, pretty much. If a child is born, has the fortunate luck to be born in during Geheimnisnacht, it probably will be born a mutant or something along those lines. It's pretty much necromancers and vampires get stronger. All manner of evil stuff. It's at its maximum capacity. It's chaos, magic, demon cults, necromancy, vampirism. All that wonderful stuff. It's at its peak with Moorsleeve hanging low and full during Geheimnisnacht. There's one other night in the Warhammer world which is pretty much of equal ill omen, called Hexensnacht, Witching Night. But we're not going to focus on that today. I just wanted to reference that there's, as if the people of the Empire were not unlucky enough to have one, they have two nights where, Moorsleeve is closest to the planet.
Yeah, and even though Felix is scared shitless, being lost in the woods at night and seeing the full moon of Morsley orbiting over him, Gotrek, though, his companion, is not afraid because, well, that's something we'll discuss later, of course, on what exactly the Slayer is. But whilst Felix is scared, Gotrek is out, roaring, demanding someone to face him. Come on, Beastmen, come and face your death. Felix, though, is hiding in the bush because he's having none of that.
Yeah, I mean, you can't exactly blame the poor man. I mean, and you cannot exactly blame poor Felix for being terrified because, well, we're gonna discuss what a Slayer is later, but basically speaking, Felix throughout this story and most of his adventures with Gotrek is a character that he can hold his own, but he's very human in the sense that he is not fearless in the face of a night where the literal forces of hell can literally show up on your doorstep. So he is pretty much scared shitless, and Gotrek is not helping by crying, with his big, with his dwarfish roars of challenge to whatever beastmen are prowling in the woods at the middle of the night during Geheimnisnacht.
And and to say something about Felix is that in this short story and the other stories are a part of Trollslayer, he is very green, and it makes sense because he is like a young college kid who got kicked out of college just recently. So, and if I was able to predict his age, and I think I did this just last year on how old he is, I think he will be around 22. Or by the time of this story.
I mean, it does seem like a good estimation for Felix, for Felix's age. I mean, we know that he pretty much got kicked out of the College of Altdorf because he killed a man in a duel, and he is the son of a merchant. So he's pretty much a rich boy that likes that likes theater and poetry, but happens to be a good fencer, but has never gone out into the world. He's as you say, still very green, and he will be greener still with the green light of Morsleaf, raining down shining down upon him.
Awesome reference, awesome. But Gotrek is out there roaring for a challenge, and eventually a challenge does come to him, but it's not through a beastman or some mutant or a goblin. Instead, it's a black stagecoach that narrowly avoids him. And Gotrek, though, is more pissed off that he almost got run over by the said stagecoach, and he told his young companion who in the bush, "The damn thing nearly ran me over. Let's go after him." And Felix just goes, "Oh," as he follows the crazed dwarf down the dark, narrow forest.
Yeah. Or how did I end up in this situation? And here Felix tells us, well, the reason he ended up in this situation is thanks to the great counselor, the great counselor of all great decisions, alcohol. So basically, Felix swore an oath to follow Gotrek and to wherever he went and record his doom. More on that later. Because Gotrek saved his life, apparently from being trampled under the hoofs of the Emperor's cavalry. I don't know if by Emperor's cavalry they mean the Reichsguard, but essentially, after a night of drinking, and anyone who knows anything about dwarves in any type of fiction, drinking with a dwarf will get you the biggest hangover ever. He, in the throes of alcohol, he swore an oath of, brotherhood, essentially, to Gotrek. And if you know anything about Warhammer dwarves, is that they take oath very, very seriously. Whether you were drunk or not, that's completely irrelevant. And Felix, it's honorably enough, like goes along with this. He he goes along with this, even though a lot of people were like most humans would have said something like, "Oh, that doesn't count. I was drunk."
And we'll talk about why Felix almost got run over by the Emperor's cavalry very soon, but very soon in the podcast. But yeah, so he follows Gotrek into the fort. He continues following Gotrek till eventually they come across an inn. Though this inn doesn't have the said black stagecoach within, where the other horses and ponies are being held at. Though Felix finds this a good time to offer Gotrek, let's stay here for the night until Geheimnisnacht is over. Gotrek doesn't want to do that, but then Felix says they will have beer, or beer and ale at the end, and it's like,
yeah. Well,
yeah.
That's, a good suggestion, Manling.
Despite how wary human alcohol is compared to dwarfs.
Yeah, like apparently human beer is like is yellow water in comparison to the dwarfish beer. But beer is beer, and so that's enough. That's enough for Gotrek.
They try entering the inn, but of course it's barred for the night because no one stupid enough goes out on German Halloween. Though Gotrek is not having it, even though the innkeeper tells them, thinking that they're either chaos cultists or beastmen, telling, "Be gone, you demons of the pit!" And Gotrek,
in the name of Sigma.
Though Gotrek's not having it, and he's like, "Right, I'm going in." He begins chopping through the door. Felix is like,
"Here's Gotrek."
Though Felix does save the innkeeper for having to pay 2 crowns for a new door. Yeah, and it's like, if you still want your door, I suggest you open up. And yeah, eventually the innkeeper lets them in. Just before Gotrek destroys their entire door and probably even the foundations of the said inn. And as they're about to rest for the night, they come in. They also see some mercenaries also within the said inn. And Felix, though, he just wants to drink and eat for a night, probably get a nice bed too. Gotrek keeps commenting about all more ale, give me more ale. And the innkeeper decides this is a good time to tell him about that their sons are missing that night after her wife is, the wife shows her distress for obviously her son being gone for the night.
Yeah, every time there's this funny moment where, Gotrek and Felix ask for food and ale. Well, Gotrek demands ale and more ale because the moment the ale gets to the table, the ale is gone, basically, because dwarf. If you've started to notice, now that you mention it, Lewis, when you told me that the whole groundwork for what would become the Gotrek and Felix series came out of a session of Warhammer role-playing game. Well, it kind of it's kind of obvious when you think about it, because they run into an inn. Well, they start to eat, and then the innkeeper, casually mentions, their missing son, giving them a quest, giving them the background for the quest. So it does resemble the beginning of an RPG quest in ale and innkeeper giving information and all.
It definitely does, and it definitely feels like something could be from a video game too, like an RPG game.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But Felix is like, okay, just don't say too much in front of the dwarf. And eventually, when they talk about a potential chaos cult that's within the forest that once a year kidnap little babies and children to sacrifice for their dark rituals, Gotrek gets interested in this, hearing about the idea of cultists and probable demon sacrifices, which could lead to him slaying a demon, or hopefully have the demon slay him.
Yes.
And he's like, yeah, we'll go out and search for your son. And Felix is like, oh, God damn it. Or Sigmar, damn it.
Yeah, Sigmar, damn it. It should be noted that, funnily enough, like, the merchants and mercenaries that are on the inn, Gotrek, like, he's pissed off because he almost got run over by a black coach, so he immediately, ask hey, do you anyone know of a black coach, like no market with no markings, pulled by black horses? And that's where the innkeeper starts giving information, the merchants and mercenaries as well, and the wife of the innkeeper starts crying, to which Gotrek very bluntly state, why is the wench crying? Why is the wench wailing? So basically, the son of this couple went out, I think, to chop wood during the evening and promised to be back, but he isn't. And apparently last year, the fiance of the innkeeper's, son also went missing after seeing the black coach. So the black coach, comes, is seen every Geheimnisnacht, and people go missing. People that seen it go missing. I think, if I remember correctly, the son's name is Gunther. That's not too important.
That's right.
Yeah,
that's
his name.
Just a fun fact. And yeah, basically how we're doing this story so far, I basically set the concrete into the hole, and you actually make the foundations of the said concrete.
Yeah, sorry. Go details. They are important.
Oh no, it's a good thing. It's like I just throw on the paint onto the canvas, and you actually make the shapes on this said canvas. So thanks for actually helping setting up the scene.
Always a pleasure, brother.
But yeah, so as Gotrek is drinking some more alcohol and food to get himself ready for the fight, the mercenaries are actually interested in Felix, saying, why are you going with him? You don't really have to. And Felix is like, I swore an oath to follow him and record his doom. And he's trying not to say too much on why he swore an oath. Nice voice crack, Lewis, but oh well. But then Gotrek thought this was a good time to boast about how he saved him from the Emperor's cavalry. And Felix is like, fuck. And he's like, and mercenaries are acting shocked at this, and they're like, an insurrectionist. And now they think now that Felix is a anarchist or a commie or something like that. Or was a certain thing happened on January 6th, I'm not allowed to talk about on YouTube before. But anyway, so Felix is pretty much annoyed by this and all the accusations, and he's like, it was an unfair and unjust tax. Emperor Karl Franz was taxing us on windows this time. And
it was a window tax.
And at this point, this is when this is when Felix was, sometime after he accidentally killed the student at the duel at his college. And when his father disowned him, he ran away to the downer parts of the city, living amongst the common people that he always thought were like a whole new other species to him, as a rich kid. Mm-hmm. And when the Windows tax started to affect people like him and the people he was amongst, he was like, we have the right to protest. We have the right to do like these protest marches across to the Emperor's palace. We have all these petitions. He has to listen to us, right? Because this is unjust and unfair.
Yeah, like basically, at this moment of his life, Felix is your stereotypical rich kid, high school, college dropout that decides to become an activist.
Exactly.
Basically.
But for an actual cause, it's not like he's
Yeah, an actual cost. Fun fact: the window property tax is based on a real life thing from I think from the 18th century in England. That's all I'm going to say because Lewis knows very well. The moment I start talking about history, I'll pretty much hijack the entire podcast and turn it into a history podcast. But that it was a real thing in England.
And I actually made this reference to the Napoleonic years when King Louis had also enforced a windows tax on the common people to help pay off for the government and all that. It's like, you have 3 windows, so you have to pay this much in taxes.
Yeah, pretty much. Something to, an observation to be made here. In early Warhammer fantasy literature, since they were kind of still fleshing out the details of the world, the Empire, all the nations of Warhammer world are in this strange position in which they are both in decadence, but at the same time on the verge of resurgence if they do things right. But early in Warhammer fantasy, Warhammer fantasy literature, for example, here, based on what we've seen or what we heard about that tax and the way that it was repressed by the Emperor's cavalry, well, it paints a picture of Emperor Karl Franz as some tyrannical despot, which is very different from the griffin wielding hammer swinging badass that most people think of when they think of Emperor Karl Franz. Because it's pretty much stated that Karl Franz is the most competent emperor the Empire has had in years, basically. So you kind of see a little bit of that, a bit of a discrepancy there, and because this is still very early into the, into fleshing out the world of Warhammer Fantasy, if I remember correctly.
And that actually I found interesting when we were having that convo on Twitter a little while ago about, the stage of where Warhammer Fantasy was at when the story was being written. And if I would like to comment, is that even if it is so, I think this paints an interesting picture on, Karl Franz and himself, perhaps, is that even though he is, as you say, the confident, riding on a griffin, I have the holy hammer of Sigmar, I'm the champion of the Empire, probably all of humanity in itself. I think it is interesting that even if this is early years Warhammer Fantasy applied to the story, I think it would be interesting that even though he is this quote unquote chosen one of the Empire, he's still a politician. He still has to, get money for his military campaigns. And well, if you really need to squeeze money out of the peasantry somehow, so yep, you have a certain amount of windows. You gotta pay this much in taxes because we gotta go kill some orcs in the next few months.
Yeah, well, yeah, that's actually a pretty good point, honestly. In fact, and it's a shame because I don't think there's any real novels from Franz's perspective, which is a real shame. That would be a very interesting read. But definitely, Karl Franz is. It's the image that we get from him, even in late Warhammer Fantasy, is of a honorable man, but still pragmatic enough to be ruthless when needed. Simply for the sake of protecting the Empire, basically. But this is not a podcast about Karl Franz, but just as a fun fact.
And yes, George R. R. Martin, we found out about his tax policies. But yeah, so Yeah.
That was perfect.
I know. I've been wanting to say something like that for years.
Yes, that was perfect. Uh,
So yeah, the mercenaries think that, oh, we'll get a big reward if we turn Felix into the Empire, because of course this is the best of nights and best of situations to do something like that. This is where Felix will tell him, well, Gotrek here actually slayed the cavalry to save my life, so that's why I swore the oath to him. And this gets him to back off, of course. But before we actually get to the part in which they actually enter the woods to go and find the Darkstone Ring, where the Chaos Cultists are doing their little ritual that we'll talk about later. I think this is a good time to pause again and talk about what exactly a Slayer is and why it's such a big thing for the dwarves, yeah?
yes, definitely.
So, what exactly is a Slayer, right? So, if I were to give my little piece about what a Slayer is to the audience and all that, so basically, if a dwarf were to commit some kind of crime or bring shame to the clan or to his people, or perhaps even if he is the last living member of, say, his community or said village or said clan, then because he had brought so much shame to himself or his people, he would then go, well, to his choosing, to a special shrine in which he'll shave off his hair to make it look into a crest, paint it a reddish orange along with his beard, give himself tattoos, and live a new life as a Slayer. And as a Slayer, he is supposed to find a worthy death in the battlefield to redeem himself.
Basically, in Warhammer Fantasy, the traditional characteristics of all fantasy races and species are dialed up to 11. So the elves are more arrogant than they normally are, and the dwarves are more honorable, but also more, more spiteful than they normally are. And when we mentioned that dwarves take all oaths and promises very seriously, and if you promise something to a dwarf, the dwarf will expect you to fulfill it. Well, we're not joking. So dwarves take oaths, honor, and promises extremely seriously, to the point of being fanatical. And when a dwarf swears the oath of the Slayer, basically, it's pretty much they do it when there's no other option left. This is not an oath that they swear either lightly or for some minor offense. It is normally done out of something, like a really, 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 really big shame to them or to their clan or their community or to a comrade. It's the last. It's the last option, because once you swear the Slayer oath, there's only one way out of it, in a coffin, basically. They, as Lewis said, they go to a shrine of the dwarf ancestor god of war, Grimnir, in Karak Kadrin. That's the shrine of Grimnir in Karak Kadrin. That's where they swear the Slayer oath. The gist of it is die on, honorable combat, normally at a disadvantage, because Slayers do not wear either armor or shield. They're supposed to be at a disadvantage, and to die for redemption, redeem their honor, and to have a death worthy of being remembered in song and saga. And that's precisely the reason Felix is there, because Felix is a poet, and who resides in, someone for the glorious death in battle to count, it needs to be witnessed, and it needs to be put into song. So that's why Felix is there with Gotrek. If you're still doubtful of what a Slayer is, just think the deathcore of Creek, but obsession with dying to redeem themselves, but without the all quiet on the Western Front flavor.
Exactly. And yeah, it's hard for me to remember like some of the names because I don't speak dwarf, of course, but what I think is also
Yours is a weak race, manling.
or whatever. But if I could also say something about the Slayers is that like you said, they do have to fight at disadvantage, right? It's not like they can just run up to a group of human knights and, you know, expect them to fight them and slay them, or hopefully get them to slay him. Because technically that is a crime, and what they're not supposed to commit another crime. They're supposed to find redemption, and killing normal humans who have nothing to do with him or his clan or the dwarves, well, that's not honorable at all. And typically they would go after, say, orcs or a troll or a giant, creatures in which tower over them and who are like malicious creatures and entities who are against, you know, both races, but against humans and against dwarves. So this way, they do find that redemption if they were to slay, well, if they were to keep being slayed by them during combat, because they're fighting against the darkness of the world, you know?
Yes, definitely.
And what's also interesting is that whilst there's no actual ranking system within the Slayer cult, there is more or less a written, you know, ranking system within the Slayer cult, actually. So, what does this mean? Well, it means is that if, say, a Slayer were to slay multiple trolls and he hasn't died from them yet, then he would be titled a Troll Slayer, right?
Yeah,
And
that means technically that's interpreted by them as Grimnir, the ancestor dwarf and god of war, as, you know, he is saving a much worthier, grander death because, well, the bigger the, you know, the bigger and tougher the enemy, they fell in battle and they fall themselves in battle, you know, the more glorious it will be, the vigor, the redemption, so to speak.
exactly, and if they were to slay by anything else lesser than a troll, then it is considered more or less a suicide. So say if a young dwarf who has joined the Slayer cult decides to go and fight some orcs and he gets killed by them before he even gets a chance of killing a troll, then, well, his judgment by Grimnir wasn't that big to begin with, and it was more or less a suicide than an actual grace from Grimnir, you know?
Yeah, definitely. I think the ranks, and I will say them very quickly so we can get back to the story. But I think it's Trollslayer, Giant Slayer, Dragon Slayer, and Demon Slayer. It's not an actual ranking, but it is kind of like a, you know,
Experience.
honorary title of, you know, the big stuff that a Slayer has managed to survive and kill, and, you know, which means that their eventual doom that they're seeking, a mighty doom, like Gotrek loves to say, will be, you know, far more glorious.
But if I could also just say one thing real quick, just to, you know, also set the scene, is that it's not really a good thing if a Slayer didn't die and the creature is supposed to fight, you know? If a Slayer were to slay a dragon and he still survived from that, even though what he did was such a good thing for, you know, the community and for the people, technically for himself, well, Grimnir hasn't found him, you know, worthy of
glorious death.
Yeah. And when this happens, well, and what I find really interesting about this, especially with the character of Gotrek, is that this does eventually bring a form of depression because they haven't found, you know, peace yet. They haven't found their forgiveness by Grimnir yet. And because of that, they'll lead to alcoholism, obsession with food and eventual scarring themselves. And this does bring like a sort of, tragedy to all this, because it's like they want forgiveness, but Grimnir hasn't found them worthy of that said forgiveness yet,
Yes, I think even Felix mentions this, that his interactions with Gotrek like varied from from periods of rage and boast, from they were either rage-filled enthusiasm or almost depressive melancholy. With long periods of where Gotrek will just be silent and melancholic, will not be do anything other than brooding, that's what we meant when we said that Gotrek is the worst slayer of all time, because for all the things he eventually manages to kill, he himself doesn't get killed, which means he sucks at his job.
But without dragging the podcast any further with backstory and lore, but that's what most of you guys are here for. You are for the meat of the stuff. But continuing on with the story, I think. So Gotrek and Felix eventually get to go to the Dark Woods. But before they do, and this is very important to note, is that the innkeeper's wife decides to give Felix what is basically the Rosary of Sigmar, right? And says, my son has his twin. It will protect you from the darkness. And Felix is like, well, very good. It served him. But he doesn't say this to her, of course. He just says thank you and puts it in his pocket. But yeah, the innkeeper's husband, or the actual innkeeper himself, he leads Gotrek and Felix to the Dark Woods as far as he can, to where the path to Darkstone Reign begins. They begin walking through the Dark Woods. Felix is getting really scared at this point because fog is setting in. Gotrek is concentrating on how to find the Darkstone Reign, of course, and even though
more sleeve is shining down upon him.
Yeah, and even though he was very excited to find his doom, so soon, so quickly, he is, like you said, during earlier, he is very melancholic, and he is starting to realize, oh, my death is actually coming. And even though he tries not to show this, you can see he is getting like some sort of anxiety from this, even though he doesn't say it, and he doesn't really express it.
Felix notices it.
Yeah, Felix does notice. Like he sees it in his eyes and all that,
Yes, which is very interesting, because Felix, at this point, we've seen Felix express anxiety, nervousness, and downright fear at pretty much everything, because, well, he's a city boy that found himself with a dwarf in the middle of the woods in basically Devil's Night. So it's like it makes sense that he is terrified. But for the short time we've known Gotrek at this point, like Gotrek has been, pretty daring, mysterious, literally screaming at the beastmen to come face him and challenge him. Gotrek seems like a character that knows no fear, much like a Space Marine knows no fear. But for all his seeking of redemption, there's this. I actually like this moment very much. Gotrek is still a person, and even though he hides it very well, because due to bravery, of course, the prospect of dying is still, if not terrifying, it's still something that at least induces some level of anxiety on him.
Mm-hmm. And I guess to get some of that anxiety out of him, he decides to comment about how corrupted Felix's empire is, saying that Felix, with all these chaos cultists and mutants and all that within your communities, are your people that corrupted that they are so liberal on this?
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, the opinion of the dwarves on the humans vary from, in Warhammer Fantasy, vary from we are best friends to you're unworthy of your ancestors and Sigmar's legacy to the modern empire. They think them as they gotten weak and soft and have allowed themselves to be corrupted by chaos. Which to what Felix actually responds very with a very harsh accusation to Gotrek, like that not all men are like this like there are still good men that fight the darkness, and that's rich for him to be saying, because aren't there a group of dwarves that worship the ruinous powers, and like Gotrek goes silent and he gets angry for a moment, but you kind of see him like he concedes to what Felix is saying, like we swore eternal war upon those wretches, which he's talking, of course, about the Dawizar, the Chaos Dwarves. These are dwarves that are corrupted by chaos, basically.
And he's like, we do not talk about such things lightly, and this gets Felix to understand, okay, just don't bring that up again.
Okay.
Though, of course, later, he also decides to ask him, so what actually got you into becoming a Slayer, Gotrek? Because by this time, he never actually asked him how he became a Slayer and why he became a Slayer. Gotrek looks, set on killing him by that question, but he then says, if anyone else had asked me that, I would have slayed them, but I can't do that to you because you're considered my blood kin now, and that will make me a kinslayer, and I'm trying to redeem myself. But just to let you know, I also don't talk about such things lightly, and I prefer to keep such things, quiet. And this also gets a message across to Felix. It's like, okay, just don't ask him that again.
Yeah, pretty much.
And eventually through the series, you'll actually find out why Gotrek exactly asked for, or why Gotrek became a Slayer, but that's not in this video, of course.
Yeah, and that's great news because I haven't reached that still, so spoilers. But anyway, Gotrek and Felix are making their way through the forest, and then they start to hear the sound of drums and chanting,
and whips and moans.
And whips and moans,
but before we get to that, just after they actually encountered their first mutants, before they actually entered the actual ritual itself, but that's not so much important. But it does set the scene on what they're going to be fighting against: a warped human with melting flesh, and with an insane voice in him, and. Yeah, Felix, of course, is like, oh, shit, because it's his first time actually coming across mutants.
Yeah. Pretty much like Felix has this momentary, almost borderline breakdown, imagining what kind of horrors are awaiting him at, once they reach the dark, the Darkstone Ring. He's not disappointed because once they reach the Darkstone Ring, which is a ring made of standing stones, should I describe it or do you want to describe it?
I want you to describe it, man. You describe it. Set the scene for us.
Okay. So Gotrek and Felix make their way until they find a clearing in the forest where the dark stone ring lies. There's the beating, the ritual chanting, the beating of drums, more sleeves, fell green light illuminates the place. There's, I think, if I remember correctly, there's braziers of some sort of incense, or an incense-like substance that gives the whole place a smoky haze kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And three things. The first one, well, the black coach without any markings and with black horses, it's definitely there. There are robed people conducting what's obviously a ritual in the middle of the Darkstone Ring. And 3, there's a full-blown satanic orgy occurring as they speak, with all manner of humans, mutants, and beastmen
Are there
participating in it.
Are there beastmen in this?
I mean,
ritual?
I think, well, beastmen are normally classified as mutants, but if I recall correctly, I think he does mention mutants that pretty much are described the same thing as beastmen, like people with goats' heads and hooves. So,
right.
So I will, we're talking about from normal-looking humans to mutants that have translucent skin to horns and hooves like beastmen. Some have beaks and feathers, and some of them, and this is the best part. Some of them, Felix described them as they were more flesh, mouth, and flesh with wriggling flesh and mouth than anything else. So John Carpenter's The Thing is also joining in on the fun.
Exactly.
Basically. Have that mental image. And the people in the circle doing the ritual, they're scourging themselves and each other with I think they're not whips. It's kind of like they're like branches, I think.
That's right.
Yeah, and well, they seem to be crying, and that's both pain and pleasure. And of course, if that didn't make it obviously enough, I think we know which chaos. Everybody knows by this point which chaos god these people are worshiping just by that sentence alone. I will also add that the smoky, hazy smoke has kind of a narcotic effect on the place. And Felix swears to Sigma that he sees sort of like the outline of a figure that's like overlooking the whole thing, and that's starting to, become more solid the more the ritual progresses. A thing that has several limbs, which is most likely a keeper of secrets, a greater demon of Slanesh. And they pretty much. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
And if I could give a quick comment and all that, is that this is also Felix's very first introduction, like actual first exposure to a chaos cult and what they exactly do. Like, he heard about this kind of stuff in his college and word of mouth back at City, but he has never actually encountered a chaos cult before and what they exactly do. And so seeing this for a first time, that's one hell of a first time experience.
In Geheimnisnacht, I need to remind again.
Yeah. Because I guess like back at his college or back at his city, the whole idea sounds more like, edgy college kids, kind of like in the real world, taking the Eucharist on Halloween to actually, quote unquote, call Satan, but it's just like hippie stuff that they don't actually know.
Yeah.
But but because it's also having on Geheimnisnacht, and because, as I said earlier in the podcast, that the borders between reality and chaos become so paper thin, rituals such as this would, of course, be able to summon a keeper of secrets so easily.
Yeah.
And
go ahead.
Yeah, to further comment about the keeper of secrets is that, so because it's also written during the very young years of Warhammer Fantasy, you can imagine the model of this time being not anything so much bigger than a human. But considering that where Warhammer is right now and what the modern day Keeper of Secrets looks like, I personally imagine this Keeper of Secrets and this story in particular being this towering monster that we all know as of today in its model form,
Yeah,
That just sounds just more exciting for this sort of scene, you know?
it does. It does feel more poignant, more menacing. To be fair, and as if it wasn't menacing enough. And poor Felix. That's like Felix in this moment is the equivalent of someone who. Okay, I think it's established that Felix does believe in Sigmar and the gods of the Empire. I have never figured how devout he is in that regard, but for what he comments, he does. He does believe in them, and this is what Felix is witnessing here. Is the equivalent of someone that says, "Oh yeah, I do believe in God and I do believe in the devil," and he hears about a possession story, but he only hears about it, but then he witnesses one firsthand, and like the thing, having that thing in front of you happening before your eyes. That's a whole different experience, and I must say, and the last thing that to set the scene before we get into the action, well. In the inn, they said that the Black Coach steals children, and they indeed do, because the people chanting, which, by the way, they're chanting Slanesh, and so, yeah, they're worshipping Slanesh. Well, they're putting babies in an altar, and, well, they're pulling out the leader of the coven pulls out a ritualized dagger and and holds it over the baby. So, well, we all know now what's going on there. So yeah, great first experience for Felix. I think he said that. I think he references this night in future novels several times, if I remember correctly.
He does look back on this when especially encountering, demons and all that again. But before the cultists, though, could practice Planned Parenthood, eventually Felix snaps out. Oh, why make this podcast political? Felix and Gotrek eventually snap out of their, shock at this, and Felix, thinking this is the best time, instead of charging in, he says no, and thinking the cultists would go, oh, the guy said no, I should probably stop now. But of course, everyone's disturbed at their rituals being disturbed, and seeing the human and dwarf, they're all like, kill the interloper. And Gotrek, finding his, thinking, oh, here's my doom, charges in, begins slaying cultists and mutants and John Carpenter's the things left and right. Felix is more or less in the background while he's still shocked of, all the limbs and all the corpses that Gotrek is falling. He though is not just in the background for long, because he too is starting to fight other mutants and all that.
Yeah, there's it's established that Felix, despite his sheltered city, college city boy origins, he's actually a pretty good fencer, so pretty handy with his sword. So he puts those skills that got him kicked out of, kicked out of college to good use, and pretty much starts following Gotrek's example of, putting the abominations to the sword, essentially. Although, of course, he's not. He is not the literal hurricane of blood and death that Gotrek is with his rune axe, but he makes he makes pretty good work on them. But I think he almost gets killed, but I don't remember by what exactly. Do you remember, Lewis?
Well, he does get his ankles chewed by a particular slimy moment with, snake-like legs, but he doesn't necessarily almost die in this. But before we continue, I just find it interesting is that earlier, before we actually got into the cult scene, Felix was talking to Gotrek, trying to tell him why humans tend to like shelter young children who have been shown to have chaos mutations and who are on the road of becoming mutants. He does show pity in them, even though to Gotrek that's like, why? But yeah, earlier he was showing his pity towards chaos mutants and why it's unfortunate. But now that he's at the Darkstone Reign and he's seen all these mutants and seen what they're doing, that is more or less a reality check to him.
Yeah, pretty much so. I mean, that shows a bit of the grimdark of fantasy, even though it's a bit more hopeful than 40k, because in the Empire, in the world of Warhammer, basically mutation, it's all caused by by exposure to chaos at some degree. And it honestly could be anything. It could be an extra limb, an extra head, tentacles, feathers, hoops, whatever, and Felix mentions and Gotrek implies that if I think dwarves have a higher resistance to chaos corruption. Of course, they're not immune to it, because if they did, the chaos dwarves would not exist. But and he Gotrek implies that anyone born amongst the dwarves that shows signs of chaos mutation is immediately killed or abandoned. And as you say, Felix speaks about how he feels pity for them and explains to them that because even though they're mutants and freaks or whatever, a lot of people will still consider them their family, so they shelter them, even though I don't think there's ever been a chaos corrupted mutant that has been able to deny the pull of chaos towards, becoming an actual agent of chaos in the Empire. Not that I know of. So
because because even though they might be sheltered for a while, they eventually run away into the woods. Yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But it's not actually Felix that's about to be near to death in this particular situation. It's actually Gotrek.
Yes,
because
that's right.
He eventually gets piled on, and Felix is thinking, well, it looks like he's finally found his doom.
Yeah.
And he could have had this moment to turn tail and run, thinking his job was over. But he then notices that the figure above him is actually starting to become more solidified and is about to be born within reality.
Yeah.
And the
veil is sorry for interrupting you, but the veil is thinning more and more.
And the cultist leader himself is still about to sacrifice the baby, and he's thinking if he doesn't do anything right now, then there could be something much worse coming for him soon. And he then finds this this is the perfect time in which he draws his dagger, prays to Sigmar to guide the blade. He throws at the chaos cultist, and it lands home. And the ritual is stopped. The figure above him vanishes. And all the cultists eventually turn to him, thinking, "What did you just do?" And
they all kind of stop, and they're like, "The orgy is over." And funny thing, something to note is that when the leader of the cult dies, the figure of the keeper of secrets that's about to come in through the veil of reality, kind of Felix describes how he hears he kind of feels or hears some a moan or a sense of frustration from the thing, like I was this close, the demon is gets frustrated because he was just, it was just about to materialize in the in the mortal coil,
And it basically got blue balled at this scene. or you mean she almost got blue balled? Jesus, Lewis, you turf.
Slanesh, right?
Lewis, you turf. But before I get canceled, eventually Gotrek finds this as Gray's time to, why do I keep saying that? Gotrek breaks out of the pile-on and he continues slaying the cultists left and right. And Felix joins him, of course. And to quickly summarize this, they do kill everyone within the Dark Stone Ring, saving the baby. And Gotrek, though, even though he just stopped the ritual and he did a great thing for humans who are probably around the forest and probably the wider empire, he is very frustrated still, thinking, Manling, I was just denied my doom. And he looks to Felix like red rage, thinking, was it you? Did you deny me my death? But then he laughs, thinking, Grimnir probably has something greater for me down the road. So even though he got denied his death, he's excited that there's probably something greater for him to come.
Yeah. Essentially. Essentially that pretty much describes how Gotrek feels every time that he fights something. Mix of frustration, pride, and anticipation of the next big thing to come. Also, it should be noted, remember that the reason that Gotrek and Felix had, journeyed to the Darkstone Ring in the first place was to look for the son of the innkeepers. Mm-hmm. Well, they look amongst the corpses and upon the carnage that both Gotrek and Felix had had all inflicted upon the chaos cult. He finds a man and a woman, and one of the ones that was dancing and chanting amongst the Darkstone Ring, has a silver amulet of a hammer identical to the one that it was given to him by the innkeeper's wife. Well, I guess we know that poor, those parents should have been stricter with his son.
So checked his internet.
Yeah, parents check the internet of your sons. They might join a cult.
What's worse of your parents checking through your internet history is bots taking your internet data. So that's why this video is sponsored by NordVPN. NordVPN is the most reliable internet security network that you can have for your personal devices. So just, this joke is over. I already did one of Raid Shadow Legends, but, so Felix, at this point, when he finds us, he's not like, oh no, what have I done? He's more like, well, I guess we're not going back to the inn. Being a little disappointed that they can't go back and drink for the night and rest for the night.
What are they exactly supposed to do? Excuse me, Frau. It's worth noting that it's a good detail on this story is that since the Empire is the Holy Roman Empire, the Germanic Holy Roman Empire, in fantasy, they use for the sake of flavor, they use, instead of saying saying Mr. or Mrs., they use Herr or Frau or Fraulein as the honorifics, the way that you refer to people. I thought that was a nice detail, but but what is Felix supposed to do? Meine Frau, your son, well, it turns out he joined a weird, creepy sex cult. That's why he was missing. His fiance too. Also, sure.
And we accidentally killed him, so can we get that free L now?
Well, maybe not so accidentally, but He wasn't a Slanesh cult. He probably deserved it anyway. I don't know if you thought about this, but this is something that I actually thought, that the baby about to be sacrificed was. I always thought, it's never confirmed, of course, but I always thought that it was the kid of the son and his fiance, because I think that it states that his corpse is next to that, to that of a woman. So it's implied that, the fiance that disappeared the year before was also, she disappeared also because she was a member of the Slaneshi cult.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I always consider that the baby about to be sacrificed was their kid. And as messed up as that is, that would be very in line for chaos. Like, that would be a finer sacrifice than just some random baby that you kidnapped. Your own child would, gain you more dark favors with the dark gods than just some child that you kidnapped from someone else, because it has more significance.
That would make sense. That would make sense, though, but I don't think they make any kind of like reference or hints that it could have been theirs, or if they had a kid at all before they took part in the cult. But not to be so focused on that, I will say that what they do instead of going back to the inn is that they take the black stagecoach and they decide, well, we can't just drop the baby off at the inn, or what do we exactly do with the baby? So instead they go, or what is now considered by this time a local legend, is that a temple of Shalia finds one night after Geheimnisnacht a baby wrapped in some blankets and the rosary of Sigmar hanging around his or her neck. I'm not sure if it's baby's boy or girl, but details. But
they never specified if it was a boy or a girl.
Yeah, but so that's now a local community legend now, where a temple of Shalia finds a baby at its doorstep with a black stagecoach taken off from sight, which does also bring the end to the story. And yeah, considering that this is Gotrek and Felix's first ever adventures, and this is the starting point on what would become a legendary duo and all that, I gotta say, it was really well. I really liked it, and again, considering this is the starting off point, this is an excellent introduction to the characters. But what do you think?
Yeah, it was a very solid introduction. It had, I think, like I said at the beginning, all the crucial elements for the story in Warhammer fantasy, chaos cult, knight of ill omen, two lone travelers, people, and a demon cult. So I think it is a pretty solid introduction, and it sets up the tone of it being dark fantasy, because, well, first of all, we see what's essentially a satanic mutant orgy in the story, and the person that that the quest giver, the innkeeper gives the quest that Gotrek and Felix, eventually, they obtain through the innkeeper to rescue his son. Well, it turns out that the person that they went out to rescue was kind of part of the problem, and so he didn't need rescuing. Well, maybe he did, but not in that sense. Mm-hmm. So it does set the tone of, this is dark fantasy, so not all stories are gonna end up with a uplifting ending. The story pretty much ends with Felix realizing that he has to save a kid, but it turns out that the person that they had come here to save, wasn't missing, but was part of the diabolic evil cult, and they killed him. They killed him during the fighting, and even if they didn't, they probably would have done it anyway because chaos Slanesh cult. So I think it sets up the tone of the world pretty well, in my opinion. It's a very good introduction to the very basic elements of Warhammer Fantasy. A very good first step for anyone that wants to get in and get into Warhammer Fantasy.
And I will also say that it is like you said, it is an excellent introduction to the grimdark fantasy setting like Warhammer Fantasy, though not so extreme that you would compare it to something like Berserk, yeah?
Well, for a moment it skirts the line, but it's not as explicit as Berserk, because Berserk, it's all in your face. Like
there's no subtlety at all.
Berserk, like they both have demon orgies, but in Berserk it's all up in your face, like all explicit. None of it is implied. Everything is, full,
and probably involves a horse.
Well, considering the variety of mutations that were in the party that they stumbled upon, maybe there was a horse mutant somewhere.
But yeah, like I said, this was an excellent introduction to the characters and to the potential book series that would come soon after. And this was a fun experience being able to talk about this set story, and I certainly had a good time.
Yeah, so did I. Thank you again for having me, for inviting me, Lewis.
Yeah, no problem. And if I think there's more of Gotrek and Felix we can cover, then yeah, I'll definitely do like a sequel to this and probably have it be about Skaven Slayer.
Oh yeah, Skaven Slayer is a great introduction to the threat beneath. Let's just call it that.
And a particular cartoon villain that will be a reoccurring character for the two duo as well.
Yes. Well, we will talk about him in due time. If you ever want to, not only to discuss Gotrek and Felix, but maybe discuss another Warhammer story, whatever that may be. Well, we're open to suggestions, I would imagine.
Of course. And besides all that, though, I will also like to announce that this is my last video for the year. And for the rest of this year, I'll be taking a break off of YouTube, and I will be back by next year in 2023, probably either January or February, with all new content, all new podcast episodes. And so, yeah, expect more videos coming in 2023. And hopefully by that time, I can get my automotive license, so that way I can make even more videos. But with all that, though, thank you all for watching, and I'll see you all again next year. Thank you, and have a good time. See you around, guys.